I'm Eleesha Tucker. I'm the Director of Education for the Society of Cincinnati, and this is Dr. Robert Allison. He's the chair of the History Department at Suffolk University, and he also teaches at the Harvard Extension School. He earned his doctorate from Harvard University in the history of American civilizations, and he's also authored and edited several books, and two of which are related to our topic today, the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party, and it's part of the New England Remembers series and is published by Commonwealth Communications. So we'll start with the topic that happened first, the Boston Massacre. So in the foreword, you write, Monday, March 5th, 1770, a weekend of tension between the British soldiers and Boston rope workers exploded into a riot at Dock Square, which spilled over into King Street. Under attack by the mob, 7 British soldiers fired into the crowd. 3 men, Crispus Attucks, Samuel Gray, and James Caldwell, died on the streets. Samuel Maverick and Patrick Carr were dead within the week. The official British report called in an unhappy disturbance. But Boston leaders immediately called it a horrid massacre. So the event of March 5th and its annual so you also write that the event of March 5th and its annual commemoration made the American Revolution inevitable. What do you mean by that?
Well, you see, you just summarized it very nicely. You have 5 people dead, and British soldiers then are put on trial. Is it an unhappy disturbance, a simple street riot, some kind of an affray, or is it something more meaningful? And Samuel Adams, one of the leaders in Boston, immediately sees this as a propaganda moment to make it a horrid massacre, staging a funeral for the victims, the largest public funeral held in North America up to that time. Something like 10,000 people participated.
10,000 people? I didn't know that.
The population of Boston was only about 15,000 at the time. And following the caskets, at that then as now, if you die, your family is responsible for burying you. But some of these people weren't from Boston. None of them was very wealthy to afford a funeral, but the funerals were held at public expense. Crispus Attucks and Benjamin Caldwell, who were both sailors, didn't have any roots here. Their funeral began in Faneuil Hall, where the town meeting happened. And the procession carried their bodies and the body of Samuel Maverick and James Gray from their homes. They converged in front of what's now the old State House, where the provincial government meets, and then wended their way down to the Liberty Tree on Boston Neck, and then walked around the Liberty Tree up past Boston Common to the Granary Burying Ground to a plot Samuel Adams owned. Adams wanted people to see this as the consequence of having troops in town. And ever after, on March the 5th, the following year, on March 5th, 1771, Adams organized a commemoration of it with an oration, and people illuminated their windows, and there were bonfires to commemorate this event. The church bells all tolled. And on March 5th, 1772, a similar thing, as Adams is using this to remind people. Henry Pelham, who was an artist in town, did a sketch called The Fruits of Arbitrary Power, where you have these British troops standing in the middle of the street, firing at this unarmed crowd. And behind them, looming behind, is the old State House, where the building where the provincial government met. Behind that is the first church of Boston. So you have the political and ecclesiastical power being usurped by these men with guns in the street. This is what happens when you allow armed force to rule. This is the message Adams wanted to convey. It's a message people got. Paul Revere turned that print into an engraving, sold thousands of copies of it. And at the trial of the soldiers, one of the judges talked about this copper plate engraving that's inflamed the public mind and made people misperceive what had happened, which is exactly what Adams wanted. He wanted people to get this perception of it. And the reason you can't have arbitrary force here, the reason we're self-governing people, we don't need the intrusion of these troops. So that was really the message Adams wanted to convey. And in March of 1776, when George Washington is organizing the campaign to force the British out of Boston on the night of March the 4th, he had his soldiers put fortifications at the top of Dorchester Heights in what's now South Boston. And he knew the next morning the British were going to come out and attack. And he asked, you men of Boston, will you allow them to triumph on the 5th of March?
Wow.
They all knew what the 5th of March was.
It all resonated with them.
That was. So this was the moment, and Adams seizes it to make it into this central moment. And in fact, Boston continued to observe March the 5th until 1783. At the town meeting in 1783 on March 5th, James Otis was brought out of his seclusion, and at the town meeting, they're about to commemorate the Boston Massacre. He moved that hereafter, instead of commemorating the 5th of March, we have our commemorations on the 4th of July. So it is the significant event. It wasn't inevitable that it would happen, but it's because of the carefully orchestrated campaign of Samuel Adams that it becomes the event that signals the beginning of the end of the British Empire in North America.
Wow, he was quite the craftsman.
He was, yes.
So what were the troops doing there in the first place?
The troops had come in the mid-1760s, late 1760s. The British Parliament had instituted a new series of tax revenue laws and also decided they were going to send customs commissioners to make sure people were paying their taxes on imported goods. They'll inspect ships coming into Boston and make sure everybody is paying their taxes. Now, the governor of Massachusetts knew that in 1765, when Parliament had also imposed a series of tax laws, Bostonians had rioted. They'd actually destroyed the home of Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson and a warehouse belonging to Andrew Oliver, one of the merchant in town. Customs commissioners is going to inflame this populace. So you're going to need some kind of a military force to keep order here, because this is a lawless town, a rebellious town. So he asked for and got 2 regiments of British troops. Now, Benjamin Franklin, who was the agent of the Massachusetts Assembly in London, said, sending troops to keep peace in Boston is like setting up a blacksmith's forge in a gunpowder magazine. Because you already have this town that doesn't welcome the intrusion of British authority, and now you have this visible symbol of British authority in the form of troops, and he thought it would be a disaster.
And it looks like it was.
It was a disaster. In fact, from the beginning, the troops arrived here in 1768, had no place to stay. The governor turned to the town and said, under British law, it's the responsibility of a town when troops arrive to house them. And the town said, we didn't ask for the troops, you did. You find a place to house them.
So where were they housed?
Well, initially they're camping on Boston Common. He knew it was a long-range proposition that's not going to work. This is November in Boston, and things only get worse here. And so he looks around for other places. There's a manufactory house, which was a workhouse just off the Common, and the governor knew the people there were sent there because they were poor. They can't protest if we lodge the troops there. Sends the sheriff to take possession of the manufactory house, and the tenants tell him to go away. They close the door in his face. So the sheriff goes back with some soldiers, thinking now people will be intimidated, but they're not. Now they know Samuel Adams and others are saying the troops are here to invade our liberties and so on. And the governor has a sense that if the troops start by knocking down a door and taking possession of places, people will say they're right. So they decide that what they're going to do is besiege the manufactory house. And the soldiers form a perimeter around it to starve the people out. And the townspeople actually then form a perimeter around the soldiers, and they lob loaves of bread, hams, and things over the heads of the soldiers into the second floor windows to feed the people inside. Then the sheriff notices someone climbing out of a basement window, and he thinks, aha, if they can get in and out through the basement, we can go into the basement, take possession of the house. So Sheriff Greenleaf and a couple of soldiers climb into the basement. The people inside lock them up. And so now you have the soldiers holding the manufactory house hostage, and the people in the manufactory house holding the sheriff hostage, and this siege goes on for about 2 weeks.
2 weeks?
Yeah, and then the governor says, okay, enough. He calls off the siege, and he houses soldiers actually by renting space. There are some empty warehouses and things, so he rents rooms from people who are against having the British troops there, but they don't mind making a few bucks if the governor is going to pay for housing. So
did he pay for it out of his own pocket?
It has to come out of the royal treasury. It's not going to come out of the town is not going to pay. The province isn't going to pay because both of them say we don't need the troops. And Paul Revere did an engraving of the arrival of the British troops, and what he emphasizes in it are the church steeples. You have the troops arriving, and you look at the perspective in the engraving, each soldier must be about 8 feet high, and they're all coming off of these ships. It's like the scene in Star Wars where the Death Star is sending out the pods filled with droids, and that's what Revere is conveying here. But what you notice about the town of Boston are the church steeples. It's a town where everybody is praying. We don't need troops here because we're a God-fearing people, and we're all praying. We're not out in the streets rioting or tarring and feathering customs commissioners or doing the other things that would warrant the presence of troops.